Thank you so much for coming. I just have a few preliminary remarks for you. This forum is put on by CLEAN, and that doesn't refer to us taking showers. It refers to the Cayuga Lake Environmental Action Now, and we are affiliated with the Cayuga Lake Watershed Network. We want to thank you for being here and for being so supportive. It's a fabulous group, I can tell already. I'd like to introduce the first two speakers. The first one is Kate Darfler. With nearly 10 years of experience as a geologist, Kate began her career consulting on geohazard projects in Korea, Panama, and California. She transitioned to working on brownfields and Superfund site remediation, and more recently, CO2 sequestration and oil recovery projects. Kate is a mom, and she serves on the executive board of the Tompkins County Progressives, and she's a member of CLEAN. John Dennis will be sharing that presentation with Kate. He's an environmental planner who's worked in international agriculture and conservation for more than 30 years in Asia, Afghanistan, Liberia, Pakistan, and many other countries. He designed emergency seed relief projects in Cambodia, Sudan, and Afghanistan, and focused on the mining of the world's second largest copper reserve in Indonesia. Dennis is a member of CLEAN and also the Tompkins County Environmental Management Council. So let's welcome both of those speakers. Thank you.
I wanted to welcome everyone here tonight to our presentation, and thank you all for being here. I know it's a beautiful day outside, and a lot of you would much rather be out on this lake. So taking the time tonight, and also for making Cayuga Lake a priority. This is time that you guys are spending, and we appreciate it. And then this is going to be a technical talk, so please know there will be a lot of technical discussion. Bear with us. We'll try to answer all of your questions. We'll try to get through it all. And write down your questions, as Carrie said. Grab pens. Things may be answered later on, so just kind of keep bearing with us through all the technical pieces of it. And definitely for holding your questions to the end, that's why you guys have the cards. Just a little bit about the Cayuga Lake watershed itself, which feeds into Cayuga Lake, and it's a really important asset for this region. Specifically, there's never been actually an evaluation of the worth of the lake itself, but it's at least over $1 billion based on some under-evaluations of the visitors that we get, the tourist industry, the farms, the wineries, the beer, and the property values that perimeter the lake. John.
So just a bit about the history of mining. In the 1890s, solution mining was started at the south end of the lake. And then in about 1922, room and pillar mining began. Here are just a few pictures. And right here you can see these are barges that were probably taking salt up to the Erie Canal and to other parts of the Northeast. And one of the things you can see, here's the dock. When Cargill bought the mine in 1970, a good thing happened. Fines had been dumped, so when you pull salt up and crush it, a certain percentage of the salt becomes dust and it has no economic value. And some of that was being dumped in the lake. And so when Cargill bought the mine in 1970, the chloride level in this lake was 104 milligrams per liter, which is too high. And then it dropped over the next 18 years. It still isn't down as low as it should be. So here's an aerial shot by Bill Hecht. Bill, could you raise your hand? You're somewhere here in the crowd. Oh, he's in the back, over near the tripod there. But Bill is quite a photographer. Just a few landmarks here. So the shafts that go down 2,300 feet are in this area. And I believe this is the bag house, and then over here are 3 storage pads, and over here are 2 more storage pads. And once the salt is in place, it's covered with some kind of a tarp to keep rainfall from draining things off. These are little brine ponds, and one of the issues is, well, where does the brine go when it runs off? And Cargill does have a Speedies permit, so some of the brine is still allowed to go into the lake. Dust is another issue. As you can see, this picture was taken just over here at one of Cargill's neighbors, and that's, you can see this brown area right here is probably due to brine runoff. And a few pictures underground. I think most of these are from this mine, but these are sourced from Cargill. Loaders pouring. Explosives are used to break up the rock salt. It's then transported, crushed, sent by conveyor belt long distances. Some of it ends up in railroad cars, as you can see. I believe in February 2 years ago, a very busy time, there were 600 tractor-trailer loads that were leaving in a given day. So a lot of traffic on the roads as well. And almost all of this is road salt used to help make roads safer during the winter. There may be some environmental impacts as that runs off into streams and things, but we don't have time to talk about that this evening. A few more pictures underground. This is I'll just quickly mention, this is the Shaft 4 location, the 1 mile tunnel. These little black dots here are small yielding pillars. As you can see, there's 7 rows of them here in a panel that's named U61. This is what one of those looks like underground, and I believe the dimensions are somewhere in the neighborhood of 13 feet by 15 feet. But this width here is just the distance between 2 of those black things. So you can see this panel is probably on the range of 388 feet across. And the abutment pillars here are notched, but that's going into too much detail. I know my colleague Brian is worried I'm going to run over time. So very quickly, more photos by Bill Hecht inside the mine. And I think just lastly, just to revisit, the original mine in 1922 was mining the number 4 salt under the town. Actually, I think they started with the number 2 salt, moved down to the number 4, and then went in 1968, began digging ramps down to the number 6 salt. I've heard a rumor that during that time when they were digging those ramps, the previous company actually did a panel across the lake. But I don't know if that's actually true. The southern reserves go probably down a little south of here. We have another map which shows them, but the southern reserves have not been exploited, and there's something called the Fir Tree Point anticline, which goes through here. I believe that may be the obstruction which is keeping these reserves from being mined. As you can see, Cargill sort of went up the middle of the lake, and then at a certain point began going up from here, and then presently they're going up, sort of hugging the shoreline. And this, the red color is 2017 to 18. And I'd like to, at this point, to turn it over to Kate. One more slide for me. 2 more. So let me just run the corner here. So will Shaft 4 make the mine safer? Definitely yes. As a former volunteer firefighter, I can say the more exits possible from a place in trouble, the better. There was a tragic situation in 1968 when 21 Cargill miners died in the Belle Isle salt mine due to the fact there was only one shaft, and I believe the shaft itself caught fire, so there was no way for the miners to get out. And if they are mining at the north face here, it would be much quicker to get to this shaft than to have to go 7 miles all the way down to one of these shafts. So without question, this, from a safety perspective, this is a good thing. But looking at the bigger picture, this would cost in the neighborhood of $45 million, so Cargill would need to keep mining for many years after that. And as you mine north, the bedrock separation between the lake and the salt formation gets narrower. So that could enhance risk, but the geologist will talk more about that. So 2 of Cargill's mines, one at Lake Erie, the Whiskey Island mine, and this one are underwater. Mining under bodies of water allows for somewhat higher extraction rates, and therefore you make somewhat more money for each acre mined. And subsidence effects aren't seen because the lake is self-leveling. and then there's only one owner. You just have to negotiate, in this case with the Office of General Services in Albany, come up with a contract. And as far as I know, these mineral resources under the lake have never been put up for a competitive bid. And that's, I'm going to turn the rest over. This looks a little too dense for me. There you are.
All right, and as I said, there are going to be a lot of technical points discussed this evening. So I wanted to kind of key your ears into some of the key pieces that you'll hear, and also they're reiterated on your handout in some respect as well. One is the dangers that we see around upward reaming, where they drill from the bottom up versus the top down. The amount of leakage waters that could leak into the mine during that drilling process. That you're going to learn about the Respect mine collapse, and that we do not want a Respect. We do not want a collapse of this mine. We do not want hazards like that in this mine. That we have never seen a closure plan for this mine that's publicly available. There are going to be some discussions about horizontal stresses and how those are exacerbated in a valley situation like we have here with Cayuga Lake. They're going to learn about the bedrock thinning, which John referred to, where the bedrock actually dips and it becomes thinner as you move northward. And that currently that the Cargill does not recognize the state's rights to regulate their underground mining operations. And lastly, I'll just mention the financial security bond that's put in place. It's only $3.5 million for over $1 billion valued Cayuga Lake, and that we don't believe that that's enough that should be put in financial security. A little bit about geology, because that's what I do. You heard John mention the salt layers. So what are those? Those are actually individual beds of salt. They vary in thickness, up 10, 12, 15 feet thick. And they are all bedded together with other shales and dolomites and other non-mineral that you're interested in mining. Those salt beds are all combined into what's called the Syracuse Formation, and you'll hear that talked about. The Syracuse Formation is part of the greater Salina group. And I'll get back to why you want to key into those pieces. So what would happen if you were able to take a knife and cut across the Cayuga Lake and get a cross section? And I just want to note that a lot of these cross sections you'll see have vertical exaggeration. Here, sometimes they're listed, and sometimes just assume it is, because if not, because things are so wide and so deep, you wouldn't be able to see everything. So they vertically exaggerate it so you can actually see the beds. So we have this valley that was carved out by a glacier. Oops. That's this black line here that you can see carved into bedrock. That's important because then after the glaciers receded, the valley gets filled with glacial sediment. And then we have our Cayuga Lake carved into that valley sediment. This is what it looked like at Retsof. This is a cross-section at Retsof of the geologic layers there. They have the same valley, except they don't have a lake carved into theirs. It's a river that they have flowing over the surface. So very similar geology. It's the same geologic units. Down here is the Syracuse Formation. They were mining a little bit deeper down beneath the Vernon Shale. And they had a collapse in their mine that produced damage on the surface. There was a rubble chimney that formed all the way from their mine all the way to the surface, creating sinkholes. These are not minor sinkholes. These are huge. Here are the two sinkholes from the Retsof mine collapse. There was also, so what does that look like if you were to imagine it in an artistic sketch? There literally were crumbled rock all the way up to the surface, and water was able to flow in from the aquifers in the sediments and collapse the mine. And here's some pictures of what the surface expression looked like of some of the damage. Buckled roads, the big sinkholes, a farmer standing in a hole in his field. And with that, turn it back over to Carrie.
For those people who've just come in, feel free to come forward. We have a few seats here, and there are more chairs outside if you want to stay cool. So we'd love to have you feel welcome and have a seat. Again, my name is Carrie Koplinka-Layer, and I'm a member of CLEAN. We're really delighted tonight to have Richard Young join us. Richard's an Emeritus Distinguished Professor of Geological Sciences at SUNY Geneseo. And some of his interests are geomorphology, groundwater, GIS, glacial geology, sedimentation, engineering geology, environmental geology, and waste disposal. Richard's an expert on the Retsof Mine, and his talk, as you can see, is the failure of the Retsof Mine, what caused it, and does the mine under Cayuga Lake have similar risk factors? Let's welcome Richard.
All right, so I'm going to do a little bit of discussion of the Retsof situation so you can see the comparison, but I'm mostly going to stress things that aren't often discussed, namely the horizontal stress field in the rocks and what valleys do to make things unusual in terms of geologic issues. Now, the Retsof Mine is here in the Geneseo Valley. The Geneseo Valley was a finger lake for a while. The valley size is about the same. In fact, it was a finger lake for a couple hundred years probably before the Geneseo River eroded the north end of it so that it drained away, but it was intermediate in size between Cayuga and Seneca, basically. So it was a pretty good-sized lake. So I'm going to cover the area between the Geneseo Valley and the Tully Valley. All the valleys are very similar, and even though the lakes are different sizes, the valleys, in terms of their bedrock shape, are quite similar. This is the Retsof Mine, about 12 square miles underground. The Geneseo Valley was this finger lake, and when the mine collapsed and filled with water over 2 years, it affected the water wells over this distance. That white area is 17 miles long, and everybody's wells went dry. It probably affected a bigger area, but those were the only areas that were being measured at the time. The actual place where the collapse occurred is these two small rooms. They did their test area over here. The red lines are the sides of the bedrock valley, and this is the pillar situation similar to the diagrams you saw earlier, but these pillars are about 18 feet, whereas they used to basically have 80-foot pillars. So the collapse with these two red circles underneath Little Beards Creek, so there was a ready water supply. This is what it looked like in March of '94 when the collapse occurred, and then a second one occurred a few weeks later after the first one. And a similar picture that you saw before. Today it looks like this with the desalinization plant, which is no longer functioning because the state said if they paid $20 million, they wouldn't have to do any more cleanup. So the situation in the mine here, again, the Onondaga Formation is the strong rock. There's about 550 feet of glacial material and then another 600 feet to the mine, so it's about 1,100 feet. When the mine filled, it didn't just fill with water down here, but it drained all of this aquifer, which served most people as their drinking water. And in addition, because it released the pressure up here, when the wells recovered, it was all in saline water, and the saline water came from depth because the pressure gradients are upwards. So when people got their water back, it was more saline, not because of the mine, but because of the groundwater system. This is how it looks from the north end to the south. In other words, the same view you see here, but these are the actual drill holes that were drilled after the disaster. You can see it's fairly complicated compared to some of the diagrams of Cayuga Lake, but I am sure that Cayuga Lake looks just as complicated if you actually had the drill holes. In Cayuga Lake, it's not as simple, and there's only one unit. One of the last glacier advances, maybe 20,000 years ago. That's the only unit that's consistent. Now, what they did was use the small pillar method to get rid of problems. They were having roof and floor closure problems due to many things. Sometimes they're called roof and floor squeezes or floor heaves, but I think it's a lot more complicated, and I'll be explaining as we go on that there are very high horizontal stresses. The horizontal stresses are actually more than the weight of the rocks by 2 to 3 times. So what you do when you create small pillars, you allow this part of the rock to slowly subside just a little bit because you make the pillars so small that they can't hold up the entire rock column. So during the subsidence, a natural arch forms. Of course, you can't see it, but it's an imaginary arch, and basically it's just like this sort of situation, right? These things support, you're safe under here because the load is transmitted to the columns. And the same thing with this situation, right? Delicate arch. It's basically an arch structure. You know, if it weren't for the arch, if it were just pure gravity, the thing would have collapsed. But there are forces at work here. Oops. There are forces at work here which push off to the sides and, of course, hold up the arch. And, of course, there are equal and opposite forces on both sides. So basically, that's a little bit of an oversimplification, but that's why small pillar mining works the way it does. So what they did in Retsof to control these forces, which were creating this problem with roof falls that actually killed people in the past, they were getting worse as they went south. So with the small pillar method, the arch formed, but what they had miscalculated was the fact that the valley was up here. And the bigger you make the rooms, the bigger the arch gets. So if you make the rooms too big, the arch goes up into places where there's no rock. And as you can see, even the best designed structures of this type can fail. Now here's a memo was written by Gary Peterson, who I understand is working on this mine in this area as a consultant, I think anyway. This is what he wrote in November before the mine collapse. Specifically, he says they were approaching 30 feet of collapse. I'm sorry, 30 inches, and the rate was increasing instead of decreasing. So he says, he admits the experiment was too wide. And this came along with his menu. Now, I've added the red parts, but he basically was charting what was happening to the roof of the mine. This is what they thought would happen. This is what actually happened. Now, most of us, I think, as scientists, if we're looking at this, we would say, well, this is where it's going to go. But when he wrote this memo, he was about to go on a hunting trip as he ends his memo, and he says, this is what I think, and he wrote this. So it's going to slow down for some unknown reason. Obviously, a few months later, he was proven wrong. So what happened? The mine filled with water, not just from the rivers, but from the aquifers, including these specific units that have a lot of bad water in them. So the mine company, when it was all done, said, well, you don't have to worry about salt coming to the surface because as the mine is squeezed shut, which happens to all mines, as it's squeezed shut, the water will squeeze up, but it will go into the aquifers on either side, and that it'll never get up to the surface because it's brine and it's too dense. But one of the problems with that is basic first-year hydrology, and that is in any valley, you get recharge from rainfall and it goes down and comes back up again. You know, that's why rivers flow when it's not raining. They're receiving their water from these types of gradients. So if you superimpose that on this diagram, in addition to the kinds of structures we know exist, like faults and joints in the rock, what really happens is you get something like this. You get a negative pressure or positive pressure in the opposite direction, and that counterdicts any of these red arrows. And not only that, these aquifers are already full of water. There's no place for the salt to go. And then you have these reverse gradients. So eventually, just like in the Tully Valley, the saline water eventually approaches the surface, given enough time. Now, my main concentration, as I said, is on these other forces, some of which I've briefly alluded to here. But in this part of the world, our geology is such that going from Pennsylvania in the mountains to where we are, we get these kinds of folds and then occasionally thrust faults. It's all due to the fact that the continents were colliding more than once back in the dim past, hundreds of millions of years ago. So we get anticlines and synclines, but we also get those faults. The tops of the anticlines typically are going to have cracks and fractures and joints. So something like this, not surprisingly, these are areas where it's capable for water and fluids to move through these rocks quite easily. If we look at the area we're talking about here, Cayuga and Seneca Lakes, you can see there are 4 or 5 big anticlines. The one that was mentioned earlier, the fir tree, and in between each one is a syncline. In other words, a downfold next to the upfold. We also have these structures, some thrust faults. Here's the fir tree one. But the north-south faults are what we call tear faults. When you have big thrusts like this, they're basically large plates of rock that are moving. And the faults are called thrust faults because they have these low angles. So they're compressional structures, and one of the interesting things they do is they can create the repetition in the bedding, so you can see the same layer more than once in a drill hole, and that's something that Ray will talk about after I've finished. So on the ground, a real thrust fault, not here, but might look something like this. And the tear faults form because these are huge plates of rock, and sometimes tens of thousands of miles in square area, particularly some of the ones out in the western U.S. that are much younger. So what happens is different parts of the fault move at different rates, and they create these tear faults, which are fairly shallow, like the ones that have been controversial over in Seneca Lake. So we've heard about the salt beds and the Syracuse Formation. I can skip that. The other thing that's often not mentioned, and this diagram is from back in the days when fracking was the big deal, and this was in Science News. They always leave things out. And one of the things they leave out are joints and faults. They always show the layers as nice horizontal features, right? So there are plenty of ways for fluids to escape. And rock jointing is something that's pervasive, not just in this area, but anywhere in the world you go, rocks have joints, like this quarry not too far from here. You can see there are two prominent joint directions. The state of New York mapped these years ago. They know exactly where they are and what the directions are. It's no big surprise. I mean, you see them in our landscape, like the joints at Taganic and other places. So again, pathways for fluids to escape. If you look at a rock section in any cliff or quarry, you'll see there, bedding planes and joints. If you have a water well in this part of the world, chances are your well is getting water because it connects with these features, if your well is in bedrock. Now, the horizontal stress field has to do with what have colloquially been called pop-up features, and for a long time nobody really knew what they were, but we now know since about the 1980s, and this is kind of cutting-edge research, but it's been around for 30 years at least, and that is the horizontal forces are greater than the vertical rock weights down as much as 3,000 feet. It varies in different parts of the world, and in mountain areas it's more complicated, but basically horizontal stresses can be created by the fact that our continents are moving along. We're being shoved from California toward the east. We're being shoved from the Atlantic toward the west, so you might think of central New York as kind of being in a vise, being squeezed. And these are the measurements people have been making over the years to try to understand this process. And you can see here's New York somewhere here. If we look a little closer, these are the measurements made in this part of the world in the Finger Lakes. It's still a bit busy, so if you just look at this simpler diagram, we have east-west stresses in the Finger Lakes region. And how they manifest themselves in many parts in this part of the world is these pop-up structures. You often see them in quarries, but this one appeared overnight in Michigan a few years ago. Here's one in New England. I think this is the Adirondacks, I'm not sure, but the part of the world I spend a lot of time is southern Utah, northern Arizona, and these are features you see out there. This is one in central Arizona, which is pretty amazing. There are several of these. They're teepee-like structures, but I found one quite a few years ago in Gasport between Rochester and Buffalo. I didn't have a camera the day I went there, but they look the same as the ones in Utah. This is collapsed now several years later, but when I saw them, they looked just like this, and they were taller than I was. And then they collapsed because the rock is not, I believe it's the Lockport dolomite. But you can still see even today how the slabs of rock are tilted towards that teepee structure that I mentioned. The other thing that happened in the barge canal between Rochester and Buffalo was those bridges that had kind of an east-west orientation. Over 100 years, their abutments moved closer together, so they had to replace some bridges. The other thing that happens in valleys is you take off a tremendous amount of weight in the rock. So it tends to rebound. In other words, you're getting rid of all this rock, and the rock is going to move back up again, just like it did from the glaciers when they pushed the earth down. So you get a little bit of rebound, you get some fracturing in the valleys, which makes them weaker in the middle. But one of the main types of diagrams that combines all of this is the one I show you here, which has not only the horizontal forces, right, but it also has the load that's been removed, and the horizontal forces tend to create features like this: little faults, little bedding plane openings, increased permeability, and what are called strain release joints along the side of the valley. So you put all that together, and valley bottoms are very complicated, and those are the places we don't see. And when you have a lake, you're not about to drill a hole in there to find out what they look like. So here are the strain release joints in the Genesee Valley when they were building the Mount Morris Dam. All these joints showed up, so that's what I'm referring to here. That's a different phenomenon, just general release of the stresses due to the fact that the valley is not supporting the rock. In the Grand Canyon, where I do the other half of my life, this what's called the river anticline. In other words, it's just the same. Oops. Back to. It's just the same as this feature here, right? Only it's because you took away a mile of rock in the Grand Canyon. Now, there's a very good paper written by the Bureau of Mines back around the time the Retsof Mine collapsed, and you can see these same kinds of structures. These were all in coal mines, and they were concerned about the fact that whenever they go into valleys and coal mines, they get these weird roof problems. And if you look at them, you can see they look pretty similar to what I just showed you, and I'll show something even more interesting shortly. Now, if you consider the weight of the rock, it's about 2.5 times the density of water, 150 or so pounds per cubic foot. So as a rule of thumb, you can say to yourself, every foot I go down in depth, if I've got a square inch, that's 1 more pound. So if you're 200 feet down, it's 200 pounds per square inch, just as a ballpark figure. Oh, there we go again. Nope. So as a result of the forces that I talked about with the continents moving, basically you can have horizontal stresses 3 times greater than the weight of the rock at these depths, and nobody talks about this. It's been in reports given to DEC and all kinds of other people. Nobody wants to talk about it. And it's not as though it doesn't appear in the literature. It's a known fact. One example, in the Retsof mine, they had an old mine shaft they connected to for safety reasons and ventilation. And to keep the tunnel open, they put in round reinforcements, metal reinforcements. Oops. When they went in to look at these 15 years or so after they had been put in there, there's a report they wrote, and they said something strange has happened. All of our circular supports are now vertical, right? And that's what's going on. Oh, another way to look at this. You could think of it this way. Here's how the rocks would look if there weren't any valleys here. Right? Notice the arrows. But suppose you put a valley in. Where do those forces go? Right? The only place that you have brittle rock is at the bottom of the valley, so the forces get concentrated down here. Okay, how are we doing for time?
6 minutes.
All right. So that's one example. Now, the most interesting one, though, is the Tully Valley. The Tully Valley has the layers of salt. It was a solution mine. Some of you may have heard about it, and it's polluting the streams flowing north to Syracuse. Here's the Tully Valley. It's not quite as big as Cayuga or the Genesee, but I'm going to show you a section here from between 50 and 100 wells that were drilled in the area over the last century. And this is what it looks like. If you look carefully, you can see these beds have been dropped down. There are 2 little thrust faults coming in. So it's a little different. It's not like an anticline, but it's the same phenomenon. Horizontal stresses pushing the rocks together. And it looks exactly like these cases for the for the coal mines in Virginia, and I forget where else it was. So, in other words, you've got a case like this, but you're getting thrust faults in addition to these strain release things or unloading phenomena that we see. So, horizontal and vertical complications. And again, most of these things are never talked about in the environmental impact statements. That leads you to some of the pictures taken in the mine here under Cayuga Lake. In the past, they often talked about this as just being floor heaves or due to what they call pillar punching. In other words, this goes up because these are pushing down. But if you think about it, there isn't enough space here. Something is closing from the sides. Right? And I think this is another manifestation of these horizontal forces that just weren't really considered in the past. And underneath Cayuga Lake, one of the latest diagrams, lo and behold, what do we have here? A little bulge, but of course we don't have any wells down there. We can't see what it really is. I think Ray will talk more about this in his talk about what the seismic data tells us about under the lake. But my feeling would be if these things form in small valleys like this, notice these are only 200, 300 feet. If they form in small valleys, they're certainly going to form in large valleys. We can see it here in the Finger Lakes region where we have good data, and we can kind of imply that that's what's going on here. We don't really have all the answers, but basically all the things I've talked about create zones of weakness in the rocks. So horizontal forces create upbuckling. So if you're going to put a mine under something, you want to have strong rock, and you don't want to have some of the features we've been talking about. Now, if I have enough time, I have a whole series of just quickly the kinds of rock structures you see in this part of the world that are not mapped. Okay. So just some examples. Most of these things do not appear on geologic maps. First of all, faults are not just little lines of like you see in a textbook. They're zones along which much of the rock may be crushed and permeable. Here's the famous one that's part of the fir tree anticline here in the quarry, Cayuga crushed stone, which I guess I saw on field trips in 1958 as a student. Here's another one near Geneseo, not on any geologic map. Another upbuckle, again, horizontal compression. Here's another one from the Seneca Stone Quarry, the thrust fault over there, which is not on the map I showed you either. Again, the thrust fault. So, in other words, these rocks are repeating. These rocks are the same as these rocks. One in the Barge Canal near Rochester, same thing, horizontal compression. When we worked on the Sea Soap Tunnel project into Rochester, about 38 kilometers of tunnels, 300 feet underground. There weren't supposed to be any faults in Rochester. In that square, that's what we found when we put the tunnels through. So I'm sure there are just as many faults most places in New York. People just haven't recognized them. This is Bob Jacoby's map of what he thinks the major fault trends are in this part of the world, in New York. These are the ones he can confidently say definitely are there. These are the ones he thinks are there in the same article that he wrote. Now, what did the DEC do when they wrote the fracking environmental impact statement? That's the DEC map. Slightly out of date. By the way, also by the same geologist that's been working on the Retsof Mine issues. So my summary would be the significance of undefined horizontal stresses is a serious issue that nobody talks about. There are lots of unmapped structures that people just don't know about. You know, this arch idea for protection, I mean, maybe they're not planning on using it here, but as they get closer to the surface in the north, that will be an issue of some sort. And we have plenty of good evidence where we do have evidence. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Raymond Vaughan. Until 2012, Ray Vaughan worked as an environmental scientist with the Environmental Protection Bureau of the New York State Attorney General's office. Ray's a consulting geologist in environmental science in Buffalo and has years of experience with nuclear waste issues. He served since 1997 on the West Valley Citizen Task Force, which advises NYSERDA and the U.S. Department of Energy on decommissioning and cleanup activities at the nuclear waste site in West Valley, New York. His talk, as you can see, is Unresolved Geologic Questions for Salt Mining under Cayuga Lake. Welcome.
Thank you all. Next time I come, let's go sailing, but today we're stuck with unresolved geologic questions. There are really 5 areas that I want to talk about. I'll go through these in more detail, but the first area is that we do not appear to have any closure plan. What happens after the mine inevitably closes someday? We don't know when, but there are important questions that need to be asked before we get to that point. Next, the lack of clarity and transparency on collapse prevention measures. Dick Young has talked about some of that. We'll get into that in a little more detail. Thinning bedrock, another important issue. Thin in certain places and thinning toward the north. And also there are groundwater or water table issues around core hole 18 and the proposed shaft 4, for which core hole 18 is the pilot hole. And then there's a question about whether there's a fault that actually intersects core hole 18 and thus crosses the proposed path of shaft 4. We'll talk about that at the end. So I think you've all seen the location by now. With core hole 18 being here, the existing mine workings being here, expansion up in this direction in the next few years. So on the lack of a closure plan, one of the questions that faces any mine at the point when it's going to be closed down is, will the mine be flooded, which has certain advantages, at least in the short term, or will it be left dry? But in either case, if it is left dry, over time the mine will flood. There's really no question about that in the wet environment we live in the northeastern U.S. Some places perhaps salt would remain dry, even voids in salt. But here I think, especially given the pathways down into a mine, the mine will eventually flood. When it does, there's enough unmined salt in the floor and the ceiling and the pillars of the mine that salt will dissolve into this fresh water that may eventually seep into the mine. So you end up with a mine full of brine, very salty brine, about 26.5% sodium chloride. And point B there says that salt mines gradually squeeze closed. Even with the salt pillars, salt is a plastic enough material that it will gradually deform and the mine void will gradually close. When that happens, there are some things that are going on up above that are noteworthy. One is that the overlying bedrock becomes somewhat more permeable. It doesn't settle quite evenly, so pre-existing joints and faults, joints and fractures, perhaps some faults as well. But joints and fractures, like Dick Young was talking about, will typically be enlarged, at least a little bit, but that makes a big difference in terms of the permeability of the overlying bedrock to water flowing through it. Also, there's surface subsidence, which is an issue. But coming back to the point here, as the mine squeezes closed, the brine that's in it is going to be squeezed out. Where does it go? That's really the biggest question that I think is needed to be addressed in a mine closure plan. And along with that, who would take the long-term responsibility? Mine closure, this slow squeezing shut of the mine, would generally take centuries. And over that time frame, it's a very real question who would take responsibility. As you heard already, New York State let the operator of the Retsof Mine off the hook for a medium-sized financial payment, based partly on a concern that there would be no way to enforce responsibility over decades and centuries. So moving on to the next topic, lack of clarity and transparency about collapse prevention measures, including the question of the mine support pillars. You've seen a lot of pictures of and heard a lot of description of the different types of pillars, the large pillars and the yielding pillars. One of the questions that we face here is that we've had no explanation for why Cargill recently switched back from yielding pillars do large pillar mining. There may be a good reason, but it has simply not been brought out into the open for public discussion. In terms of mine stability, that's an important point. Some of the other factors that Dick Young has covered pretty well, the horizontal stress, how that affects mines, and the stress concentration that occurs under bedrock valleys that Dick showed you just a minute ago with his cardboard cutouts. Likewise, Dick talked about stress arches and whether there's adequate height and whether they're resting on adequate abutment pillars. Again, these are very important factors for ongoing mine stability. There's also a possibility of unrecognized brine pockets in the overlying bedrock. Hard to detect, but important if they're there. Going on to the third of these categories of unresolved questions, there's good evidence of thin bedrock in a couple of known places where you see the yellow star and also where you see the yellow triangle. There's readily available information that shows that the bedrock there from the top of the bedrock valley under the lake to the top of the salt is only about 100 to 120 feet. That's a lot thinner than the mine likes to talk about as its carbonate beam, the relatively strong bedrock that they believe is the main supporting member that holds up the rock above the mine roof. It's greatly thinned down to around 100 feet in a couple of locations under the lake. And the concern, as Dick Young was talking about, is that you've got potential water leakage through such a thin layer, especially when there are joints and fractures. And also, obviously, when the supporting beam is thinner, it really reduces the mechanical strength. There's a lot of concern about whether it's marginal for mine support purposes. And here's a cross-section showing what you would see across this cross-section across the lake. Here's the bedrock valley with glacial sediment and then the lake column, the water column itself above that. But from the top of the bedrock to the top of the salt is only about 120 feet at this point. The thicker beds that are considered to be ideal for mine support are more like 350 feet from here to here. But the notched out bottom of the bedrock valley cuts into that a great deal. Here's another version of the same diagram. This is from some work that geologist or geophysicist Ferguson and evaporite geologist Warren in Australia are in the process of putting together for CLEAN. This is work that we'll actually see much better detail on in the next week or so when we get a detailed report from them. But this is one of the slides they just sent us as a preliminary view. And what they see is the same thing that we've been noting, namely, in their opinion, it's as little as 80 feet, even smaller than the 100 feet to 120 feet that we've been measuring. The work that Ferguson and Warren are doing is largely based on interpreting seismic work that was done by Syracuse University geologist Schultz in 2002. What he was doing was a seismic survey along pretty much the full length of Cayuga Lake and likewise along Seneca Lake as well, but Cayuga Lake concerns us today. Their method was to do what's essentially a type of sonogram. The ship is towing a sound source, which the sound is then reflected and or refracted off of different subsurface layers. And the resulting image that they can get, as this next slide shows some of the bedrock layers. I mean, here's the lake bottom, the bottom of the water column. From here down to the bedrock surface are glacial sediments, often water-filled. But then you can see the top of the Syracuse and some of the salt beds. What's very interesting and has not been previously recognized according to Ferguson and Warren is you can actually see a salt mine. This was in 2002 before the Cayuga mine was as large as it was, large as it is today. But you can see emphasized in red here, the 2002 bounds of the salt mine actually show up loud and clear on this subsurface imaging. Very interesting way to see exactly where the mine is. This and the next slide are just a couple of pages from the preliminary information we just got from Ferguson and Warren. As I say, Clean will be getting a more detailed report soon. But just, you can see the emphasis on significant thinning. And on this next slide, you can see the emphasis on the thin section, which is going to affect the mechanically stable formations overlying the mine, with a resulting consequence of more unstable geological conditions for the mining operations. This is what is a concern in these thin spots. But even though, let me just flip back here for a second, I didn't maybe emphasize this. The mine is currently skirting these two known thin spots. But since the thinning gets worse as you go north, they do not have good prospects for continuing indefinitely northward. So the thinning problem is continuing as they go northward because the rock beds are dipping to the south, or in other words, rising toward the north, causing the depth to any given bedrock bed become less and less as you go north. So on to the water table and groundwater issues. I'll go through these individually. So the first one is point A. The pumping test that was done on behalf of Cargill showed a stabilized water level in core hole 18. It's right about here. What is somewhat puzzling about this stabilized water level is it's about 100 feet lower than the level of Cayuga Lake. That's not normally possible, that you could have a stabilized water level within a watershed that is lower than the lowest surface water in that watershed. So what could possibly explain this? The only explanation that makes hydrogeological sense is that there is a groundwater gradient away from the lake. What's really happening is that water is percolating through this valley fill aquifer here, moving along the Onondaga-Oriskany contact to reach the well, and indeed, when core hole 18 was drilled, this is where the water inflow was noted, right here. But there's enough water pressure to bring it up here. So as I say, this is a stabilized water level, but the interpretation is that there is flow from this lake-supplied aquifer in yellow that's showing up here that is indicative of flow that's moving from the lake toward the mine. So there's currently a slow rate of leakage into the mine, probably into the existing shafts several miles south of core hole 18. So one of the concerns is simply that this flow needs to be understood because it has really not been recognized as such. But the other concern is that if this flow is happening, it means that there is a connection, a hydrologic path or a leakage path from the lake-supplied valley fill aquifer to the location of core hole 18. So the leakage rate was fairly small, on the order of, I think, tens of gallons per minute when core hole 18 was bored. But the concern, which partly comes back to this question of fracture flow, which DEC and the mine operator don't fully understand, if larger water-bearing fractures are encountered when core hole 18 is enlarged, when it's reamed out to form shaft 4, there's a very real possibility of getting a much, much larger flow of water than has already been detected at the top of the Oriskany level, where this water is currently flowing into core hole 18. One of the precautions, if indeed shaft 4 goes forward, is that instead of reaming upward, as Cargill is planning to do, the reaming, in other words, the enlargement of the borehole diameter to make the shaft, should be reamed downward instead of up. That would provide a much better protection against having an uncontrolled flow of water flood the mine. You know, whether the level would actually rise to the level seen in Retsof, which they tried to stem, but were simply unable to stem that flow of water. It's not clear whether it would be as large as that, but anything approaching that would be a very disastrous problem of having the mine start to flood in an uncontrollable way. So on groundwater and water table issues, we've already talked about A, B, and C here. point D is something of concern perhaps to nearby property owners, that shaft 4 is likely to intercept water from higher perched aquifers that are currently providing drinking water to nearby residents. There were some tests that were done of some of the nearby wells, but in doing the follow-up testing of core hole 18, the sensitive tests that are normally done by hydrogeologists were not done. Those would have provided a much better indication of how likely the depletion of nearby groundwater resources would be. And this partly comes back to the question of fracture flow. A small hole may not hit a water-bearing fracture. If you enlarge that hole to 18 feet, for example, you're much more likely to intersect one or more water-bearing fractures that are going to rapidly let water flow out of nearby aquifers that residents are depending on. So the last point here is the strong possibility that a fault intersects core hole 18, and if shaft 4 goes forward, we'll intersect that as well. The evidence is kind of technical. It has to do with two things that are seen for core hole 18. One is the gamma log. This is a type of fingerprinting that's normally done whenever a well is drilled. All gas and oil wells are required to have gamma logs run. It's basically a measure of the natural radioactivity of the rock. And since the natural radioactivity varies somewhat depending on the type of rock, it can give you a fingerprint. You can tell what units you're passing down through by looking at the gamma log. But there's also some extra thickness in core hole 18 that's not seen in another well a mile away. And extra thickness would be good, you'd think. I've been talking about the problems of thinning bedrock. But if you've got extra thickness, it's good to have an explanation. So here's why I'm talking about the gamma log of the Barron well in the town of Lansing is shown here. Now this is well below the surface. Here's the Marcellus. Actually, the Marcellus is right up here, and then the Owaka Creek member is here. Top of the Onondaga is here. But the point is, these squiggly lines here are a measure of the natural radioactivity of the bedrock. And you can see that the pattern or the fingerprint for these two wells that are a mile or so apart is quite similar. That's what you'd normally expect for nearby wells. Similar here, similar here. But here in core hole 18, we've got this unexplained gamma spike that is not seen in the nearby well. Here's another well a little greater distance away where again you don't see it. So what is this? This is the question. The extra thickness you can see for here, this should line up with this. There's an extra thickness in the core hole 18 well that about corresponds to this. This may well be a thrust fault. This is the type of repeated section that Dick Young showed you that you can get as a result of a thrust fault repeating or duplicating a unit where it's passing through twice because of the thrust fault. So there are other explanations, but none of them really makes a lot of sense. We simply need a good explanation of this before shaft 4 is allowed to proceed. The consequences obviously are that a fault, if it indeed intersects the well, would provide a pathway for fluid leakage. It also would be mechanically weak. So these are the 5 points I've covered. We'll have questions later, but in closing, I just want to say what we really need here are testing, and we also need transparency by Cargill and by DEC about their test results and how those results are interpreted. Just to follow up on one of the points that I think Dick Young was making pretty clearly, if you don't ask the questions, you're not going to get the answers to certain things that are important. So it's important to push these questions. We're going to do our best, but you as citizens need to do what you can to make sure that these important questions get asked. There may be good answers out there, we just don't know, but having the questions be raised and get some plausible answers is important. Thank you.
We're going to take questions very shortly. We have two brief presentations. The second to last is by Brian Eden, who attended the first Earth Day in Washington, D.C. in 1970, and then 8 years later began working with Love Canal homeowners who were affected by the worst toxic contamination in the U.S. and he helped with the community cleanup as well as resettlement to a less toxic environment. With these residents, they created a statewide toxics coalition, and he served on the board for 20 years, participated in lobbying for the state Superfund and also brownfield cleanup programs. Brian is the chair of the Tompkins County Environmental Management Council, and let's give him a welcome.
It's sad to say that we're done with the pretty pictures and now we're going to talk about the ugly process. You know, the EMC is to seeker what ACLU is to the First Amendment. You know, one of our roles is do public education in the community, inform community members of their rights, seek to improve seeker, which we made some comments on revisions to seeker about a month ago. But they're very flawed, but they're our only pathway to participating in this process. So you may recall your years as a student in American history, you know, the separation of powers, how bills were adopted. You know, there's always, you know, there's the pretty boxes and the lines. Well, just throw that all out. Yeah, we're more sophisticated now. Anybody that watched the hearings with the Attorney General today know, you know, it's not a straight line to anything. So the theory and practice are significantly different. So put up the flow chart. So here's where we are. You know, I'm not going to go through this. All I want to show you is there was a negative declaration that was that the DEC provided to the community. Decided between them and Cargill on June 30th, 2016, and that's supposedly the end of the review process. And this was before anyone here knew there was an environmental review process. So how can we the only way we can get to the right side of the chart, the diagram, is if we get them to decide that there is actually an environmental question here. And, you know, so far, not so good. I mean, most of what we saw here tonight was not considered in the review by the DEC. So, you know, that we have to find a way to make them take this into consideration. There was the first public announcement was August 31st. It was an environmental notice bulletin. I know you all read that, you know. I think I might have been the only person that read that. But so I told a few people, and then it's published in the legal notices, and you probably read them too. So we we responded. There was a 30-day comment period. It's mostly obligatory because they've already decided there's nothing to talk about here, right? You know, so we have to be very forceful to bring that to their attention. We suggested, why don't we try to make actual notification of people that might be interested? There's a lot of constituencies here that care about the lake, you know, recreational folks, boaters, fishers, so on, anglers. So we suggested either having a public meeting, do a press release, do mailings to identifiable stakeholders. Comments could theoretically change the neg deck. But unfortunately, once you've made a decision, once an agency makes a decision, they're all in and defending it. So no matter how many things that we have Richard Young do or Ray Vaughan, they are into full-time resistance. So, so we've, you know, an example of the lack of access to the information we need. We don't have the seismic data that they did in 2016. It's incredibly critical to understand what's going on around that core hole, where the faults and stresses are. And in 2002, someone that's here today filed for a FOIL to get some of this information. And the staff denied access to it. He appealed. The chief ALJ supported the request for non-redacted seismic data, mine-specific geologic data, and 3 other kinds of data. 3 years later, the assistant commissioner reversed the decision, saying the ALJ said you were entitled to these 5 types of data. The commissioner, and I consider this a wholly political decision, decided, no, you can't have this data. They had already made the permit. They'd issued the permit 3 years earlier, but this was continuing through the system. So the ALJ issued a strong opinion. Permitting procedures are characterized as open to public scrutiny, shielding from public scrutiny the very information necessary to assess the potential environmental impacts and safety issues associated with the proposed mine is inimical to this process. So this is a type 1 action. It's presumed they have more likely to have an adverse environmental impact than other kinds of actions. The water impacts narrative in the neg deck does not address any of the issues here we talked tonight. If you want to read it, it's about a half page. It just doesn't touch any of these issues. So an EIS is required, and it's too much to do in my few minutes. I will do a handout, and you can ask me some questions. But there's a question with the segmentation issue, and that's another complicated issue that I don't have time to cover here. I'm glad to talk about it in the question and answer. So if you want to support a merit-based process, we need to get into the game. Right now, we're not into the game. The political influence from Albany is much stronger than we are. The upstate New York continues to lose jobs. The governor's quite aware of this, and so he may perceive that if we have an evidence-based environmental review here, that this will affect the long-term sustainability of the mine operation. So we really need your help to move forward with this and to create an even playing field and we get a merit-based decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Our last speaker is Walter Hang. Walter's the president of Toxics Targeting, an environmental database firm in Ithaca that provides services to government agencies, engineering consultants, and many of the largest drinking water suppliers in New York State. For more than 40 years, Walter's worked to remediate pollution hazards across New York, and in the past 20 years, Toxics Targeting has led efforts to clean up Cayuga Lake impairments. Welcome, Walter.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to see all of you here tonight, and I want to thank Clean for inviting me to speak to you. Let's see. Okay. So I met Professor Young at a very similar meeting in Pulteney, New York, where Chesapeake Energy wanted to deep well inject fracking waste into the ground right next to Cayuga Lake. And this is in the very early days of our battle to stop shale fracking in New York. And I'm sure many of you here tonight are hearing the same echoes, right? Everything is fine. We just need a couple of tweaks to the regulatory requirements, and then we're going to go forward with shale fracking without any threat to public health or drinking water and the like, right? And so at that meeting in Pulteney, it was a very similar kind of presentation. There were these regulatory requirements that weren't being addressed. You could maybe litigate. It was very complicated. Rachel Treichler was there. And so that's kind of the background. And so the reality is the following. Number one, Cargill is the biggest private corporation on the planet. Number two, they are mining underneath the lake simply to make more money. They could mine next to the lake and get all the salt they want without threatening that lake. That lake, you look out that window, that's on the 303D listing of national impaired water bodies. And after a 19-year fight, led by many of you in this room, we're going to get a total maximum daily load very shortly. Is it going to be adequate? Absolutely not. But the bottom line is the last thing we need is more pollution threatening our beautiful lake. And as you heard, this is the same Department of Mineral Resources that said everything is honky-dory. We can frack, we can mine in Geneseo, New York at Retsof with reduced pillars. We can do solution mining in Tully, New York, no problem. And then they had this incomparable disaster at Retsof. Retsof at the time was the biggest salt mine in America, the second biggest salt mine on the planet. And so you've now seen that this is the letter that the Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation wrote to Barbara Lifton. And as was noted, this project has gotten a negative declaration. And so this permit for Shaft 4 could be issued any day. And I mean any day. And so the key thing is that they're saying, we've already judged that these similar kinds of projects don't have any environmental consequences. It's as simple as that. They're not, so maybe I encourage you all, help Clean get the draft environmental impact statement proceeding. You have nothing to lose. You can ask for it. But for anyone who reads this letter, it's plain as day. The state of New York is highly reluctant to do what is entirely reasonable. They're just not going to do it, right? And so the reality is we need a political campaign. And if we don't wage the same kind of battle against Governor Cuomo that won the fight against shale fracking, we 100% protected our state from shale fracking. That's never happened in any other state with shale to frack. And it's because of many of the people in this room. So we face the same challenge. This is not a regulatory decision. It's not really a legal decision. It's basically a political decision. If we bring sufficient political force to bear, we can prevail. It's going to be really hard. So we've killed shale fracking in New York, at least so far. We've killed $4.5 billion worth of fossil fuel infrastructure projects. Again, this has never happened in any other state, and it's because we're organized. And so I implore you, help protect the lake. If you rely on the DEC to protect this lake, they're just not going to do it, right? They need our help. They need our brutal, sustained political pressure. So that's the governor's contact. That's his phone number. And arguably, most importantly, I'm going to pass this around. So I just want to close by saying, when we were in Paltney, after all these discussions about the technical requirements and all things that weren't going to be done, I just stood up and I said, how many of you have already decided that we just don't want deep well injection of fracking waste next to Cayuga Lake? And so against that background, how many of you have already decided tonight, after listening to these amazing technical presentations, that it just doesn't make any sense to continue to mine salt underneath Cayuga Lake, where a mine collapse could turn this beautiful lake into a great salt lake? How many people just think that's a really bad idea? Okay, you're with me, because I think that is an incredibly bad idea. Sign this. You know, we support asking for a draft, environmental impact statement. That's not likely to happen, but I believe we need to run a campaign, and we got to stop this. They can mine next to the lake. They can't mine anymore under the lake, and the beauty is, without that shaft 4 permit, they're not going to be able to mine under the lake anymore because they're too far away from the exit. So this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to protect our lake from salt mining. They can mine adjoining the lake, just not under the lake. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Walter. With that pep talk, we're going to move into questions and answers. The first question that's been submitted is, the mine is on state land. Why is not all of the data public?
We've alluded to this in a previous slide, that the Cargill has rejected the DEC's right to fully regulate the mine. They say that the statute and the regulations do not adequately cover subsurface mining. And there was a stipulation, the DEC entered an agreement with them in the year 2000 saying, and Cargill agreed to do certain things to, and require them to get a permit, but they would not require them to do full environmental reviews. They did a thing called an environmental assessment. It wasn't at the same level of review as an EIS would be. And so at that time, they said that the Cargill had acceded to the jurisdiction of the state, but they continue to intercede with this objection. We can't get any of the data, and the staff stands against us in trying to obtain the data. So right now, there's this legal question that Cargill has been able to raise and has managed to keep the DEC from forcing them to do what other operators and businesses do in New York State.
Okay, a question from Buzz Levine.
Yes, I've noticed on the maps of the mining under the lake that there's a large gap where there are no mine shafts from just north of the mine to the area where north of there where there's lots of mine shafts. Why is that gap there, just north of the mine of the salt works itself there? Why is that gap there, and might they decide to do more there instead of going farther north? Or why haven't they done that area already?
Okay, John will take that one.
So keeping in mind that I'm not a geologist, if you've ever been in Watkins Glen, the park at the south end of the lake there is called Clute Park, but Mr. Clute came over and started solution mining right in this area here. And in 1962, there was actually a leak where International Salt accidentally fracked into one of the Rumen pillar shafts, and it began flooding, so there was a lawsuit, and International Salt ended solution mining. But this area is sort of a terra incognita. They don't really know how big those old solution caverns are. So that this is a safety factor. I don't know why this part of, over on the western side, because I don't think there was any solution mining on that side. Maybe we'll need to ask Cargill about that. To the south, about 95% of the mining reserves there have not been mined. And again, we're not really sure, but the Fir Tree Point anticline appears to have been an obstacle that they could not mine under. And also, I was talking to a USGS geologist who just said, well, miners heard noises they didn't like, so something might have been breaking down at this end above them. I was alarmed recently when Gary Peterson, Cargill's rock mechanics specialist, advised that he thought it was prudent to be mining under this shallow area as long as large pillars were used. So these pillars here, for 33 years, Cargill has used small yielding pillars. In the middle, sometime in 2016, they were having rockfall problems in U74 here, and you can see how these mining panels are now together. That means they've shifted to large pillars here. But again, this is something I don't know too much about. We need more information from Cargill to understand this. Sorry to have gone on at some length.
Okay, a written question. How does the Hampton Corners salt mine compare to Cayuga salt mine?
The Hampton's Corner mine is just next to the collapsed Retsof Mine. It's owned by American Rock Salt locally when AkzoNobel got out of the salt business for a while anyway. And it's almost at capacity from the land they had leased, so that now they're going back under the valley. We just found out this spring, going back under the Geneseo River next to where the collapse was, with a 3,000-foot buffer.
I just wanted to add one detail. The American Rock Salt mine at Hampton Corners was required to do a DEIS before they were allowed to open in 1997. It's, I believe, a 750-page document. And so that mine does have a closure plan, whereas our mine under this lake does not yet have a closure plan. That closure plan indicates that it would be a dry abandonment, and I think we need to know more, talk to American Rock Salt a bit more, but they are quite transparent, they're friendly. I got a tour of the mine in 2015. They're sort of a family-based company, and they put a lot of value on having been in the area for many generations. Anyway, thanks.
Bit more to that. Before the mine collapsed at Retsof, they were planning on turning it over into a waste disposal area. And I'm sure they can make more money doing that than mining salt. And I wouldn't be surprised if that issue raises its head again, because that was a big deal at the time.
Zach, is there any problem with me moving this closer to the speakers? Okay. We really don't need you guys tripping all over this stuff. Now you can trip a little bit closer. Mike Sigler.
Hi, my name is Mike Sigler. I'm the county legislator for the town of Lansing. From everything I heard, you're saying that the DEC does have a lot more information than you folks do. So I just want to see if I have this correct, that your contention is basically that the DEC isn't really just wrong. They have this information, and they're misleading everybody about how safe this activity is. I mean, is that a fair summary? Thank you.
I would think that they don't necessarily have any better information. They just don't seem to be on the ball as far as knowing about geological information that's been around for 30 years, or they don't want to hear about it. It's very surprising to me, their attitude, that they won't even respond to questions when we raise the issues.
Okay, a question for Richard Young. Given what you've shared, one, that we have the same conditions as Retsof geologically, two, that horizontal pressures above the salt mine and below the lake are unknown, and three, almost all salt mines around the world have closure issues, would you recommend any more mining under Cayuga Lake ever?
That's an easy no, but I guess I think it was probably a bad idea to begin with, but no more.
Here, here.
Claire Perez?
I'm wondering if you have a communications plan and possibly an aggressive social media campaign to get to the right people in the right amount of time.
As anyone who has worked in Albany, there's only one person that makes all these decisions. So yes, there is a regulatory process, there is a Department of Environmental Conservation, but the bottom line is the governor makes all these decisions. And he recently, I think, approved a $2 million grant to help Cargill. So this, we're that close. A decision could be made any day. So sign that little clipboard and call the governor, write the governor like immediately. I mean, if we can amp up the opposition, that's going to make him hesitate. They've done a very good job of maybe delaying it, but we don't know that we've delayed it. We just know that the permit hasn't been granted. So we have to deny this permit. That's the challenge at hand as far as I'm concerned. Other people want a DEIS, other people might have other ideas, but as far as I'm, concerned, I'm with Professor Young. It just doesn't make any sense to mine underneath the lake. It's threatening the lake. Mine under the land. Go hog wild. Get all the salt you want. Just, we don't want to threaten the lake. That's what I think. And Governor Cuomo's the guy who can make that decision.
We have a couple of questions regarding mining under the land versus mining under the lake. Okay, so one question is, why is a salt mine under Cayuga Lake only under the lake? In fact, it is under parts of the land, parts of Lansing also, but I'll let the speakers address that a little bit more. A related question is it more expensive for them to mine under the land? Would they have to get owners of privately owned land to agree to lease it? Quick answer on that is they need a lease. But does someone want to expand a little bit on mining under the lake versus mining under just the land?
So going back to the Hampton Corners mine, they are only on their land. They started in 1997. Their shafts are all concrete, modernized, no wood, can't catch fire. And when you talk to them, they said, well, we're producing 4 million tons of rock salt a year compared to something over 2 million here. So the question is, well, you know, here's the larger salt mine in New York State is mining under land every day. I think they can produce up to 17,000 tons a day. And so it seems like, for some reason, Cargill is moving more slowly here. Maybe it's not as profitable, they're just sort of leveling off, or they're hitting problems. So I think we really need to ask Cargill to explain that one for us. But it has occurred to me, I would hate to see a situation where Cargill invested 15 million, 45 million, the numbers vary, to put a new shaft 4 where it is today, and then find that the problems they met last year didn't get any better as they went north a year or two from now. Maybe they should look at an alternative where shaft 4 is, say, near the rink. Core hole 17 was put in 1997. Cargill owns a lot of mineral reserves south of Gulf Creek. But one of the key things is, there's a 3,000-foot barrier pillar between the flooded Retsof Mine and the American Rock Salt's Hampton Corners mine. So you can't just say, well, we'll use our existing shafts or shaft 4 and just go east because it's no good to. You have to have at least that 3,000-foot barrier pillar. So Cargill can't use any of its existing shafts to begin mining under land and therefore protect the lake, because if you have a problem under land, you have that connectivity. So it would be like putting their new shaft 4 in a completely new direction. But I think across from the rink might be an option they should look at, because it's close to their existing facility, and you could have that 3,000-foot barrier. But I'm not a geologist. I'm just kind of making this up on the informally as I go.
Okay, landmen. Anybody ever heard that term before? Landmen? Well, they're involved here too. When they built the tunnel, they had to contract with 4 or 5 homeowners, and they did it through a service of landmen. And so what they do is they pay a royalty payment per ton removed from underneath their land. Now, how you calculate that at 2,300 feet below the surface, I'm not sure. But anyway, they do get a certain amount, like 50 cents per ton or something like that. So somebody had a question about discuss tax issues. Well, here's another very interesting issue. The state owns the lake. They own the land under the lake. So the land is tax exempt. So Cargill does not have to pay taxes on the mine under the lake. They do pay a royalty payment, but they pay no taxes. And I don't have the specific provision. It's the real property tax law, section 102, subsection 12. But anyway, if anybody wants to see the section that exempts them from taxation, I'm glad to share that.
Question was, if they mined under land, they would have to pay taxes.
Yeah, absolutely, because it's owned by someone. It's not owned by the state. If the state made a deal for some land they had, that would be the same situation.
Another question, has an independent risk assessment been made? And if so, what is the percent of risk and within how many years? If not, are there plans underway to conduct one? Risk assessment.
Let me give just a very quick answer. I think that is exactly what an environmental impact statement process is designed to do. So, to offer an answer tonight would be foolish. We really need the full study, I think. That's what EISs are for.
What negative consequences might people who are living close to where the shaft would be face to their land and other property? And I guess I might add to that their water supply. Negative consequences of people living close.
I think for the existing plans for shaft 4, a minor amount of subsidence is likely in the future. Whether it be differential subsidence that would tilt a structure or whether everything would settle evenly remains to be seen. There's also, as I said in my presentation, the risk that shaft 4, being a much larger diameter than core hole 18, will tap into some of the perched aquifers that homeowners are depending on near the mine.
So Cargill did submit a well study to DEC about whether or not shaft 4 would impact local wells, and it was the company that did the study, Spectra Environmental, argued that there were some gullies on either to the north and south of Cargill's 57-acre parcel, and that those gullies were dividers, that there would be no influence going past those. But when you go out and look at the gullies, they're only 10 or 12 feet deep, and yet most of the wells in the neighborhood go down about 100 feet. And one of Cargill's other consultants, Respect, said that when they found tritium in the core hole 18 waters down at about 1,500 meters, that tritium indicated that there was what's called a meteoric connection, meaning that rainwater from the atmosphere had gotten down to that level. And they said, well, rather than being a connection to the lake, which of course was sort of risky, not what a good consultant would conclude, they said, we think it came from solution mining about 3 miles to the south. So Respect is quite a respectable consulting firm. They're worldwide in their work. They concluded that in fact the influence you could have movement 3 or 4 miles of distance. It's very contrary to Spectra, which said anything past 1,000 yards, there wouldn't be any impact. So anyway, you have to read these consultants' reports very carefully, and unfortunately, Spectra never really wrote a report. They just sampled about 11 wells and showed the analysis for each of the wells, but they never summarized their findings, I think because they realized the findings wouldn't lead to the conclusion that would be favorable to Cargill. Thanks.
Next question, will it take a lawsuit to get DEC to revise its decision?
In the case of the Genesee Valley, they filed an Article 78 against the company for ongoing plans, and the judges ruled in our favor, but the commissioner, with a single paragraph, overturned the decision with no explanation.
You're really limited in your legal options. And Article 78 is when you sue an agency for making an arbitrary and capricious decision. Now, most judges are reluctant to intervene in decision-making processes of agencies. They have a prejudice against doing that. And also, making the arbitrary and capricious standard is very, very difficult. And right now, actually, the DEC is, I think, working against anything like that. They are preparing a responsiveness summary to our comments so that they can point to the fact is, yes, we looked at those things and we disagree with it. So that'll deal with any arbitrary and capricious. You can be wrong. You just can't, but to actually be successful, you have to prove that it's arbitrary and capricious. It's really hard to do, very hard.
Don't forget, you can ask questions from the mic, too, if you like that method. Fluid leakage was mentioned repeatedly. How much is too much? And are there state guidelines for fluid leakage?
Ray, I'm going to let Ray speak first, and maybe I'll have a comment after that.
I think it really depends on the context. The fluid leakage that was unstoppable into the Retsof mine was on the order of 20,000 gallons per minute. A lot less than that could be a concern, but it really is site-specific. So I think the studies need to be done to better characterize the fracture systems in the vicinity of core hole 18 and shaft 4. But until that's done, it's difficult to say quantitatively what the acceptable limit would be.
Kate, can you find the backup slide which shows the 3-mile pipeline? So, to my knowledge, and Cargill may want to correct me on this, but I don't know of any large amounts of leakage waters that have been stored in the mine under the lake up until now. Cargill's been storing leakage from shafts 1 and 2 in the level 4 under the town, and sometimes it hasn't been fully saturated. So there has been, one of their consultants warned, I think about 2 years ago, that some of the pillars were eroding and there was a risk of mine collapse. So when one of the questions that DEC asked about the plan to store, so that yellow pipeline would be carrying leakage waters over to panels 58 and 60. Actually, I think that's panel 60, the one with the yellow, but there would be a pond. So that's Frontenac Point there. Taganic Point is over there. Gee, that's almost looking like Taganic. But anyway, Taganic Park is just down over there. So one of the questions was for DEC was, how will the increased humidity of storing fluid in the mine year-round affect global mine stability? And Spectra's reply was basically, we're doing it already and there isn't a problem. But we know that subsidence under the town has been up to 1.5 feet over the last 30-some years. And so subsidence rates have been greater. That could be due to the fact that there are 3 levels of mining voids, whereas under the lake so far there's just been 1. But I think the conservative thing to do is for any leakage waters to be pumped back to the surface and not stored under the mine. The Hampton Corners mine isn't storing any leakage in their mine that we know of. And they say their humidity levels stick around 30% almost year-round, whereas in this mine, in the summers, it approaches 70%. And the reason that humidity is an issue is that salt creep accelerates with higher humidity levels. So to begin storing a fluid year-round would be a new humidity levels which have never been tested before.
We have a question. Could you share your full name, too?
Denise Katzman. I have 2 quick questions. Spectra, the consultant, is that the same entity as Spectra Energy from Houston, Texas?
No, Spectra Environmental began working, they are in Latham, New York, which is, I'm guessing, within 20 miles of Albany. And I'm guessing they're good at permitting because they're close to Albany. If you go to Spectra Environmental's website, this is the only salt mine that they have an involvement with. I mean, there are not a lot of salt mines as far as I know. But prior to their writing the expanded environmental assessment in year 2000, I'm not aware that they had prior salt mine experience, which I'm just surprised. I mean, Cargill is in 79 countries, have many tens of thousands of employees. I'm just a bit surprised at how they pick their consultants. Spectra didn't seem to be a stellar salt mining specialist when they got brought into the picture back in 2000.
And is there the possibility to utilize home rule at all?
Yeah, it's not something I've researched, but you know, mining is regulated currently at the state level, you know, and I'm not sure that there is any mining that's going on in New York State. I mean, there's gravel and salt mining are also, even though they're within, there's certain rights for home rule possibilities with gravel and salt mining, but I have not heard any with subsurface mining.
Could someone turn the lights on that are in this closet here? I don't know. Yeah, it's number 8 on the breaker. And you just flip it. What is the structural integrity of the bedrock between the roof of the mine and the original bottom of the lake?
It's reasonably good if there's the thickness of 350 feet that exists before the lake channel was carved out by the glaciers. Put an exact number on it would require more study of the frequency of joints and fractures, and whether they are more concentrated in certain areas. Also, there may well be tear faults, like Dick Young talked about in his presentation, running more or less north-south. There may be thrust faults as well. But in the absence of all of those things, the limestones and dolostones of the roughly 350-foot thick carbonate beam that overlies the mine is pretty good. So the wild cards, so to speak, are the gouge cut down the middle of it by the lake valley, the glacial valley that the lake now occupies, and the frequency and alignment of discontinuities, faults and fractures and joints.
Stay up here, Ray, because this one's for you, I think. So if salt columns in mining are basically plastic in geologic terms and always being compressed, is there any standard anywhere for closing a mine safely? And then there's a mention of always having subsidence or worse if water gets in.
The problem of subsidence is well recognized. So given the fact that subsidence is a very slow process, it's usually addressed as an economic impact. You may have a building that undergoes differential subsidence, especially if you're on the edge of where there's voids underneath here but not here. So your foundation will settle this way. That is, in the absence of any sudden collapse, going to be a very slow process that you can perhaps obtain damages for. I think that's the main issue there. It's a very slow process. If there's a sudden collapse, it's very different.
Just to follow up on that, what other types of procedures could a company take to close a mine safely? Is subsidence the only option?
Well, I think that Retsof has been or should have been a wake-up call because the problem of the brine going places where are going to contaminate an aquifer, that was not recognized prior to the Retsof collapse. That is an issue that I have been working to publicize in the last year or so through several sets of comments I've submitted. That issue needs much more attention. In some places, there may actually be subsurface aquifers into which the brine could be squeezed without any substantial environmental impact. But without the studies being done, here, for example, where would the brine go? Would it end up eventually impacting the lake? That's the big question here that has not been addressed. So I think that until Retsof occurred, there was very little recognition of the brine as a long-term impact. That needs much greater attention. So in terms of safe closure, that's an issue that the mining industry has not been paying attention to.
Donna Scott.
Donna Scott, Lansing Station Road, Lansing. I noticed in the picture of the new core shaft that goes down into the earth, then there's a path from it, I guess when it gets way down to the proper level under the earth, it goes off to the northwest. And it's going under a lot of property owners' land that they don't own. Have they gotten permission to go under that? And, do they need permission to go under people's land like that? And where is that actually coming out into the mine with regard to, say, Bill George Road and Lansing Station Road?
Where shaft 4 is.
Right.
Where the core hole.
Yeah, well, anyway, there was, as I explained before, they did negotiate with the landowners between core hole 4 and on their property and the lake. And so even though there's somebody that's on the lake that they only own a 100-foot wide portion they negotiated with them, Cornell Orchards and a few of the other homeowners there. So they did get permission, they did sign a contract, and the folks will get royalties for the shaft when it's constructed, and which is, not the shaft, but the tunnel, when the tunnel.
It looks like the tunnel goes a lot farther than Cornell Orchard.
So the tunnel connects from, as you can see up here where that green circle is, that's 1001 Ridge Road, and Sweezy, just for those who are a little disoriented. And it's also, if I'm not mistaken, where core hole 18 was bored, okay? And from what we can tell of what Cargill has shared, most of the tunnel is now constructed 2,200 feet under the ground, and it does include all of the landowners from the edge of the lake and the railroad all the way up to Cargill's property along Sweezy, the back portions of those people's yards. Did we answer your question?
Yeah, but last year they did a big survey in our area where they went across all kinds of woods and fields way up into Lansing Station Road. And it was about at number 425 where the stakes ended. I assume that was related to this. I don't know what else it would be for. The people who were doing it said this was a survey for Cargill. And so I just wondered if it actually, the tunnel comes up to Lansing Station Road.
Not to my knowledge, no. And I think that study was the Bay Geophysical. So they were doing a lot of soundings with a thumper truck to determine if they could get any more data, and it sounds like they did get some. Is Cargill's legal and financial liability for this salt mine capped?
You realize that when the contract between Office of General Services and Cargill expires, and Cargill has no more relationship to that land. The land is owned by the state. The state is going to be the responsible party unless they enter an agreement with Cargill for long-term maintenance of the facility.
It all depends on what kind of liability you're talking about. As you can imagine, this is a giant industrial facility. And so I actually have some data that I could be releasing in the not too distant future that could document cleanup liability. And so even if Cargill checked out, they would still be liable as an operator of the facility. So these are incredibly complicated matters, to say the least.
Linda Levine?
So if you've already answered this, then ignore me. Is it generally agreed upon that it's safer to do this not underwater? And if so, wouldn't it behoove everybody to do to be required to do some cost-benefit analysis of why they should do it under the water?
You know, you're going to hear a lot of technical analysis, but the bottom line is the water isn't as heavy as the land, right? And so there are all sorts of royalties and fees, et cetera. But I think that's pretty much the bottom line. I mean, that's why they're mining underneath the lake. And so you can ask for anything you want. But if it's not required by law, you're not going to get it. Even if it's required by law, you may not get it because law isn't, commonly being enforced, for example. Number one, this is the location of that historic Solution salt mine, okay? And I think there is an unplugged well on this property somewhere, right? And there are 5,000 of them that the state of New York hasn't plugged. So here is what Stewart Park used to look like. You could swim at Stewart Park. Well, no one's been able to swim at Stewart Park for 50 years. So the water quality exceeds the applicable standard for phosphorus, right? Because it's inundated with weeds all summer long, and it's got too much turbidity. So a kid drowned in the 60s, and then there's no more swimming. So this is totally illegal. The state of New York isn't really doing anything about it for 50 years. So that's how come when you hear all these theoretical requirements, the reality is the state of New York said there's no environmental impact. They're on the verge potentially of issuing the permit. There could be a legal challenge, but as was noted, these are very, very tough challenges. And so that's how come I think, prevention is really the key. The sooner that we can take action, the sooner we can prevent this. Again, they can mine on the land, no problem, all right? But we have to protect the lake. And it is a once in a lifetime, once in a generation opportunity because of that Shaft 4. Without Shaft 4, they're not going to be able to continue to mine under the lake.
Do you want to add any comments about under the lake versus underground?
What are the impacts of the current Cargill operations? In 10 seconds or less. No, just kidding.
Cargill's had pollution releases that have repeatedly impacted the lake, and these were never cleaned up to the applicable standards. I have the Department of Environmental Conservation's own data. The same story at the Borger compressor station site. State doesn't enforce standards. This lake hasn't met the applicable standards for decades. So, again, it's a giant operation. I mean, they've had literally like dozens and dozens and dozens of petroleum releases that were never properly cleaned up. They also have hazardous waste violations. It's a violation of federal law.
Bill? Can you use the mic? No?
The lake, Cargill has already admitted that the mine is collapsing, and their own figures that were made public show that the mine is collapsing all the way to the surface.
Did everyone hear that? Yeah. I think an observation. Mm-hmm. Okay, do you feel we've answered your questions adequately? And is there someone else with a burning question? If not, and you would like to use your, okay? Okay. Gay Nicholson.
In terms of what Clean has done so far, has Senator Helming been briefed in detail? How about the town board members? What has been our political outreach thus far?
Let me answer that. I went up to Senator Helming's office with several women from the town of Lansing several weeks ago and talked to her head caseworker. And she got on board and wrote a letter to DEC that was very similar to letters that Barbara Lifton has sent. Unfortunately, I suspect that she will get the same sort of response to her letter that Barbara Lifton got from hers, but she is on board.
Thanks, Deborah. Any other questions? Yep. It's Jan, right? Okay. Jan Quarles from Lansing.
Well, my family is in Lansing, but I'm on the other side of the lake. I just wondered, it seems like when we had this, it seems like there's an urgency of time, but in terms of what Clean is doing to expand on Gay's question, has somebody thought about a strategy like, for example, getting in touch right away with all of the counties that surround the watershed to pass resolutions against this, to get in touch with all the town boards to pass resolutions against this, like we did on Seneca Lake, because that would probably carry a certain amount of clout. Has somebody thought about getting some buses? Because you have 100,000 people here who are on your side. It's just a question of communicating and the threat, and then we far outnumber the people who are employed here by Cargill, who might be sending other letters to the governor saying that they think they should keep on doing this. So I just wondered, is there a person working on Clean? Is there a volunteer who's sort of got a strategy and anyway?
Thank you. And the answer is we have thought about it, and we need help. We need your help. We need you guys to get involved. We need you to sign up for our listserv. We're a new group. This is a new fight for us. And so we're small. So we don't have a lot of resources. This is what we need you for, and this is why we're here tonight presenting this. So we have a Facebook page. Join our Facebook page. Join our email listserv. Reach out. Say you want to join. Say you want to help out. Say that you'll take resolutions to local governments. We actually have a guy here today. He's over at the Ulysses board meeting looking at a resolution. So we are out there doing it, but we are a small number. So help us, definitely.
So the bottom line is, this is our lake, right? It's everyone in here's lake. The conversation so far has been a two-way conversation. The neg deck was issued before any of you even knew that it had happened. So we got to break down this two-way conversation between the regulator and the regulated. We need to get your interests represented, and there's a lot of interest here. And there's, in addition to the folks that are here, there are ecologists, but there's the recreation industry, the state's parks people, the adjoining municipalities. They all need to be engaged with this so that we can get into the game. Right now, we're not. And so everybody needs to go back. If you're not a Lansing resident, you need to go back to your constituency, your municipality, and say, we need to support folks on this issue. So, you know, on our website will be our list of what were our goals and objectives. We showed it to you before. And you'll hear more from us as we go forward, but we really need to, the time is now, you know, and it's summer and people are going on vacation. This is the time when it's most dangerous, when there's not enough people around to make an issue out of something like this. So we really need you to do something immediately. Thanks a lot. Yes, Marie.
Is somebody writing a model or a resolution?
We have a resolution. I can give it to you.
You do?
Yes.
So someone recently asked what's Cargill's impact here, and I think, you know, it needs to be said that Cargill does pay about $10 million, perhaps more, in annual salaries to at least 180 employees. That's helping the Tompkins County economy grow. You know, Tompkins County is probably the only county in upstate New York that's been gaining population over the last 20 years. We have a winning economy, and therefore, you know, I think, to be polite, Cargill gives a lot of money to World Wildlife Fund, an organization I once worked for, to CARE, etc. So, you know, I think we should also invite Cargill to make an example of this mine as having the best closure plan, the most forward-looking planning, transitioning, just the way Cayuga Power is talking about getting involved in photovoltaics, putting you know, alternative energy on a brownfield. There are lots of innovative things here. So I think, you know, part of the communication process needs to involve reaching out to Cargill as well, getting them involved, and learning more about, you know, what did their seismic study show last year? You know, I'm not sure that the DEC's been able to see that study. So I think, you know, it needs to be said, try to include Cargill in the conversation. So far, our attempts haven't been particularly smooth, but so, you know, I think a lot more needs to be learned. There are a lot of studies. I'll give you one funny example. When Cargill was doing their well study, a guy sort of flagged down one of the surveyors and said, you know, my beach well has gone saline. We don't know when it happened, because it was actually the neighbor, and the neighbor was very elderly, but when we bought it, all the plumbing was rusted out in the house, and but my beach well, just up the, you know, here, it's still good. You know, what's going on? So when you look at the map, that beach well is just above panel U53, you know, so is it mining related? We don't know, but I think with good science, you know, we've sampled that well, we've sent it off to Sean Frape at the University of Toronto. He's going to do some isotopic studies, but you can really apply the science and say, you know, what is happening? You know, so anyway, the politics is one thing, you know, digging away at the science, talking to good geologists, you know, like Richard and Ray. Walter, of course, is more on the politics of things, and Walter is separate. Walter, as you probably know, does his own thing. He's made a point of saying he's not part of CLEAN, but again, he's you know, he's someone who is an important voice. So anyway, I'm talking too much, but I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. It's been fantastic to see Another question at the microphone. Anyway, thanks.
My name is Matt Butler. I work for the Ithaca Times, actually. Why was it allowed, or how was it allowed to get to the point where this could be approved any day before there was this sort of public rallying cry?
I think Brian has really already spoken to that. The neg deck was just happened.
Yeah. Well, it's not unusual. Most environmental reviews in this country are type 2. In New York State is type 2, where there's no even environmental assessment forms that are filled out. Very few actual projects get a full environmental impact assessment. And it's been going down substantially since the seeker law was introduced in the 1980s. So there's a lot of resistance between people that are doing developments and municipalities that find it to be, the paperwork to be onerous. So that's why, I've been speaking for seeker here, that we need to defend as, as flawed as the law is, it's our only avenue into this whole review process. So we need to defend it and make sure that they don't make it any weaker as they just attempted to do. So, yeah, the neg deck would happen. Nobody knew about it, and they published it in very places where you would not see it, and then they refused to do any sort of publication, even though the seeker regs contemplate them doing things to reach out to people.
I just want to thank you all. If you have questions, our address is here, and one last hand for the speakers.